Establishing central dominance, this pawn immediately claims valuable space and prepares for rapid piece development. Immediately contesting the center and developing a piece, Black signals their readiness for an open game. Asserting central presence, this pawn launch immediately contests space and prepares to deploy queenside forces, aiming for a dynamic game. Opening the diagonal for the dark-squared bishop and preparing for a solid pawn structure, this move gracefully sidesteps immediate sharp lines. Nurturing central control, the knight gallops to a flexible square, preparing for pawn advances or future queenside pressure. Challenging the center immediately, this pawn push sparks dynamic possibilities and seeks to disrupt White's spatial advantage. Securing central space, this way immediately restricts Black's pieces, creating an isolated pawn structure that demands careful handling. Opening the queenside pawn structure is a sensible choice, creating more dynamic play and potential for counterplay on that flank. Solidifying central control, this knight prepares for a potential kingside castling concert and pressures Black's cramped queenside. Opening the center with this capture creates immediate dynamic imbalance and tactical possibilities across the now fluid board. Opening the c-file here decisively reclaims the pawn and prepares to contest the crucial central territory, potentially forcing Black into a cramped defensive posture as White marshals forces for a kingside assault. Embarking on a fianchetto with this pawn structure signals an immediate intention to control the long diagonal and pressure White's center, potentially creating dynamic imbalances from this relatively quiet position. Preventing the knight from hopping to g4 or bishop to h5, this move solidifies the pawn chain and aims to keep the Black kingside cramped, potentially creating opportunities for a kingside attack later if Black doesn't find active counterplay. Developing the bishop to the long diagonal immediately puts pressure on White's central pawn structure, aiming to exploit the potentially weak d5 square. This natural development also prepares for castling, a crucial step in securing the king's safety. The bishop's presence here discourages White's pieces from comfortably occupying the e4 or c4 squares, creating a dynamic interplay of forces. Asserting central control, White grabs much-needed space with this pawn push, aiming to build a strong pawn center and restrict Black's pieces. Securing the monarch safely on the king side, Black prioritizes king safety above all else, a sound decision as the center's tension promises complications. The Black king, now tucked away, allows the rooks to connect and potentially join the action, preparing for a more active role in the middle game struggle. This castling maneuver is a crucial step in preparing counterplay, aiming to mobilize the queenside pieces and challenge White's central space. Having brought the king to relative safety, Black can now focus on developing the remaining minor pieces and establishing a solid defensive structure. Castling here is a tactical necessity, preventing any premature attacks on the king and setting the stage for a more balanced positional battle. Developing the bishop to an active diagonal targets the queenside and supports the eventual e5 pawn push, aiming to restrict Black's knight and open lines for White's pieces. Developing the bishop here aims to connect the rooks and prepare for potential pawn breaks, but it also grants White's knight a temporary outpost on e5 if the pawn on d6 were to advance. Consider how this piece placement influences the long-term struggle for central control. Safeguarding the monarch by tucking it away behind a pawn wall offers immediate security, preparing for future pawn pushes and piece development, while simultaneously challenging Black's central influence by closing the d-file for now. Initiating a bold queenside expansion, Black aims to unbalance the position and create counterplay, challenging White's central grip by forcing a reaction on the flank. Befriending the bishop on c1, this repositioning prepares to exert pressure along the newly opened diagonal, aiming to dislodge Black's resilient pawn chain and create attacking possibilities on the king side. Black immediately challenges White's central pawn majority, a bold maneuver aiming to disrupt White's harmonious development by pushing the c pawn forward. This creates significant spatial tension on the queen side, potentially leading to a pawn race or forcing White to commit their pieces to specific squares to defend the advance, thereby defining the pawn structure for the upcoming middle game. The immediate consequence is that the pawn on d5 becomes a more prominent target, and the bishop on g7 now has a clearer diagonal to influence. The bishop retreats to c2, not only securing the pawn on d5, but also initiating a strategic repositioning that aims to activate the piece on the long diagonal, potentially influencing the queenside and the center simultaneously. Challenging white's central grip, the queen embarks on a bold sortie to b6, threatening to dismantle black's kingside pawn structure and inject immediate dynamism into the position. This maneuver not only eyes the c4 pawn, but also prepares for a potential pawn storm on the queenside, creating a fascinating battle for space and initiative. Embracing a sharp pawn thrust, white aims to pry open the queenside, potentially creating lasting weaknesses for black's structure and asserting greater influence over critical squares. Initiating the capture opens a dynamic battle on the central files, challenging white's pawn chain and aiming to destabilize the kingside structure. Unleashing the knight here aggressively challenges black's pawn structure, forcing a strategic decision with significant implications for the subsequent development and piece activity. Shifting the knight to the queenside allows it to participate in the pawn storm and potentially threaten squares like c5 or even d4 if the e5 pawn retreats. Sacrificing the knight here offers a compelling exchange that aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and exploit potential weaknesses around their king. By removing the knight from the d7 square, white opens up the e-file for potential pressure and creates an opportunity to develop the queen into a more active central position, potentially targeting black's queenside pawn chain. Consider the resulting pawn formation. A doubled pawn on the c-file for black might become a target for white's remaining pieces, creating long-term structural disadvantages. This move also forces black to make a decision about recapturing, which could lead to further positional concessions. Reclaiming central space and developing piece activity are key as black absorbs the knight's pressure and reestablishes a more balanced pawn structure, aiming to challenge white's slightly advanced pawns and unblock the path for the queenside rook. A bold pawn thrust, opening aggressive lines and challenging black's central influence, potentially creating weaknesses around the enemy king if coordination falters. Sensing an opportunity, black repositions the knight towards the queenside, eyeing squares like c2 and potentially creating a dynamic imbalance to offset white's central pawn majority. Solidifying the d6 pawn and preparing to bring the knight to a more active square. While the immediate threat on b4 is neutralized, the repositioning of the bishop might signal a subtle shift in white's strategic aims, perhaps hinting at future kingside expansion or a coordinated attack on the queenside pawn structure. The move creates a pleasant dilemma for black. Either address the potential for a knight outpost on e5 or continue with their queenside initiative. Observe how the central pawns remain locked, creating a strategic bottleneck that will demand careful maneuvering from both sides. This quiet development prioritizes piece coordination over immediate tactical fireworks, typical of this positional battle. Reassessing the pawn storm after the minor piece exchange, this retreat brings the queen back to a safer square, though it concedes valuable central space and diminishes attacking potential on the queenside. Finally releasing the grip on the d-pawn, white pivots the bishop towards the queenside, aiming to bolster the e-pawn's advance and potentially create pressure on black's somewhat restricted position. Liberating the queenside rook from its passive guard of the c4 pawn, this maneuver immediately challenges white's asserted central control and introduces immediate play along the newly opened semi-open file. Cracking open the queenside with an aggressive pawn thrust, white seeks to dismantle black's solid structure and exploit the weakened squares, particularly the c4 outpost. This pawn advance doesn't just gain space, it also creates dynamic possibilities for white's pieces, potentially opening lines for their rook on the c-file or forcing black to commit their pieces to defensive maneuvers. The challenge for black now is to find a harmonious response, lest they find their queenside crumbling under the pressure and their king exposed. Black reinforces the queenside pawn chain, a necessary defensive maneuver to prevent white's a4 push from fully opening the file and creating immediate pressure against the queenside majority. This solidifies the c4 pawn and prepares to potentially challenge white's central control. A dynamic redistribution of forces initiates, aiming to pry open the queenside while simultaneously bolstering central control, a nuanced approach to counter black's ambitious queenside expansion. A subtle attempt to secure queenside expansion, though it concedes control of the c4 square and potentially weakens the pawn chain. Unleashing the rook onto the d-file immediately targets the pawn chain's anchor and opens up aggressive possibilities. Reinvigorating the rook on the e-file, this maneuver seeks to dislodge white's dominant e5 pawn and potentially open lines for counterplay, aiming to exploit any lingering weaknesses in white's pawn structure or king safety that may arise from the aggressive pawn push on d6. White repositions the bishop to *c2*, preparing to defend the *c4* pawn should black attempt to leverage the weakened queenside structure. This subtle retreat, while seemingly passive, aims to solidify white's central control and prevent any immediate tactical breaches on the queenside where black's pieces have begun to gather. It's a testament to the intricate dance of positional maneuvering, where every square can become a battleground for influence. The bishop's new post also potentially eyes the *g6 pawn indirectly, adding another layer of defensive consideration for black. Shifting the queen to the kingside flank creates immediate attacking potential, eyeing the h2 pawn and threatening to disrupt white's pawn structure, while also potentially setting up for future incursions on the weakened light squares around the white king. Gaining a crucial tempo, this retreat skillfully sidesteps the bishop's confrontation, preserving its defensive capabilities and preparing for a potential queenside expansion or a more active central role later on. Shifting the rook to this open file immediately challenges white's queenside pawn structure and aims to create counterplay by potentially menacing the b3 pawn, while also freeing the c8 rook for more active participation. Challenging the robust pawn chain with a knight sacrifice, *nd5* dramatically alters the game's complexion, aiming to pry open lines around black's seemingly secure king and create immediate attacking potential. The rook's repositioning to d8 is a defensive necessity, shoring up the king's protection and preparing to contest the open d-file, a crucial pathway for white's advanced pawn. Reinforcing the queenside pawn chain becomes paramount as white's knight eyes the potentially weak c6 square. A bid for counterplay on the d-file, aiming to neutralize white's central pawn and disrupt their coordination. The rook vacates the e8 square, opening lines for potentially more dynamic piece activity elsewhere. This maneuver, while seemingly passive, aims to solidify black's structure and prevent white from exploiting weaknesses. Reasserting pressure on the c-file, the bishop occupies an active diagonal, aiming to disrupt black's queenside expansion and potentially create mating threats or tactical opportunities against the vulnerable king. The rook's dramatic leap to the 5th rank initiates a fascinating positional struggle, immediately challenging white's control over the h-file and hinting at potential queenside expansion or a dangerous infiltration. Boldly reinforcing the central space, this maneuver aims to solidify white's knight's outpost on f4, preparing for a potential queenside pawn push, or, perhaps more subtly, rerouting the knight to a more active square like e3 or d5, creating new attacking avenues. Reclaiming the initiative on the queenside with that knight maneuver aims to contest the open files, but it leaves the kingside a bit exposed to white's attacking potential. Sacrificing the queen opens a tense middle game where the rook on the d-file now becomes paramount, aiming to exploit the d6 pawn's advanced position. The exchange of queens opens a new chapter, immediately confronting the doubled pawns on black's queenside with their newfound mobility and threatening to unravel white's defensive structure. Suddenly, a powerful knight jump forces the black king into a defensive posture, potentially disrupting the coordination of the remaining pieces.